What do you define as a Beatle?
As what we are, you know, a group, singing and selling records.
Ladies and gentlemen, they will be here soon. They're ready for you. Are you ready for them?
They were the most influential band the music industry has ever seen.
After a tumultuous opening concert last night, hundreds of fans have been crowding around the group's hotel today, shouting, "We want the Beatles."
Their fame was new, massive, and continues to this day.
They're in the newspapers all the time, and for some of the dumbest stuff on God's green earth.
Our staff scientist, in an odd moment, calculated that this young mob is generating enough energy to put 3 Atlas missiles in orbit and power 54,000 transistor radios.
Whenever we're doing the show, the police always come and say, "Don't look out the window, you know, because you're excited."
I've seen nothing since Beatlemania to be mentioned in the same breath.
They are the best-selling band of all time, with over 183 million sales worldwide and a net worth of $600 million.
I don't mind, you know. It's all right.
After the Shea Stadium, there was nothing else they could ever want to achieve as artists.
I mean, is it fun for you? Or... Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, it'd be fun for you, wouldn't it?
They have transformed the music industry with their unique sound, inspired countless bands all over the globe, and introduced generation after generation to the sound of the 60s.
I mean, there was no music like it before. It put what was probably something not everyone was maybe aware of on the map.
They will go down as one of the great things this country has produced. The Fab Four, they will.
Join us as we explore the story behind the greatest rock band of all time.
I'd just like to say the same as the others. Thanks for the Purple Hearts.
This is your ticket to ride. This is the Beatles. (1957) Liverpool, England. Rock and roll and blues are an upcoming music genre making waves throughout post-war Britain. A young John Lennon, living at 251 Menlove Avenue, developed a passion for the blues, and his first band, the Quarrymen, was born with a selection of his close school friends. Embracing this musical sound, the band found themselves playing their first gig at their local church fair at just the age of 16 years old. It was here Lennon would meet his new songwriting partner and start the biggest rock band of all time.
In many of these escapades of early rock and rollers, you're in the periphery of a number of gangs and scenes that sometimes overlap, so you know Tommy or Timmy a little bit, but not a lot. So McCartney and Lennon had maybe a vague awareness of each other, but on July 6, 1957, Pete Shotton invited Sir Paul, then just a little tyke, to come see John Lennon, who was, I think, a year and a half older, that they were going to play a gig. And Lennon and the guys on the back, as I recall, was a laureate. The Wooten Village Fete. Lennon was playing acoustic guitar, tuned to banjo string tuning, so he's making banjo chords. And I've looked at that photograph of the very, very early Quarrymen with John Lennon there. The photograph's taken the day McCartney met him. And I've often wondered, what did they sound like? Were they any good?
That will be the day when you make me cry. That will be the day when you say goodbye. You say you're gonna leave, you know it's a lie. That'll be the day when I die.
The Quarrymen played what was called skiffle music, which was an emerging kind of rock and roll, but it's putting jazz into it, it's putting folk, some blues, so it's combining all these things, and that was really the kind of beginning part of the Beatles.
When McCartney came on the scene, Lennon was allegedly singing Come Go With Me by the Dull Vikings, yet John Lennon was singing the great classic Come, 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 come and go with me down, 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 down to the penitentiary. Well, of course, no 1950s love song references the penitentiary. Lennon was just making this stuff up. So they had a bond right there, not just that they both loved the music and the guitar and all that, but that McCartney knew some of the words that John Lennon didn't. So it must have been a heck of a meeting of the minds that July 6th day. Must have been incredible.
After that chance encounter, Paul McCartney and John Lennon started to jam together to get to know each other's sound. Lennon continued to focus on his main band, the Quarrymen, but after a year realized that the only way he could evolve his sound was to bring Paul McCartney into the band.
A lot of rock bands, of course, form by experienced musicians get in a room. You're the best bass player here. You're the greatest drummer here. And, you know, stuff like that. That's how bands form. But the Beatles didn't really form. They evolved. They were originally John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen. And as time went on, and the fashion for the washtub bass and Lonnie Donegan covers started falling apart, and Chuck Berry's replacing Lonnie Donegan, they evolved. And Lennon was evolving with the music, sort of leading the pack. So he gets McCartney in the band, and the band is strengthened. And a little later, they got George Harrison in the band. So the Beatles weren't formed like a manager in a room with a big cigar said, we'll get this guy, we'll get that guy. And they weren't formed in the basement one day, let's call this guy. They evolved from the early days of the Quarrymen. They evolved organically and naturally by two things, a love of the music, and as Ringo has said many, many times, it evolved from four guys who loved each other. And he's quite right.
The Quarrymen had split up, and off the back of this split, John Lennon and Paul McCartney came together and formed the Beatles. The original lineup consisted of John Lennon on vocals and lead guitar, Paul McCartney on backing vocals and backing guitar, McCartney's closest school friend George Harrison on third guitar, Stuart Sutcliffe on bass, and Pete Best on drums. The band moved to Hamburg, arranged by their unofficial manager, Alan Williams. The Beatles went on to play a variety of clubs in the red light district. Here they performed a selection of covers and some of their newly written songs. But, unfortunately, their early music wasn't a hit.
Early on, the Beatles started writing, and they were relatively underdeveloped, heavily influenced almost to the point of being a pastiche of Elvis. You know, when you hear these tunes like In Spite of All the Danger and Hello Little Girl, From a Window, I mean, these are really early attempts at something that would blossom later.
I'll do anything for you, anything you want me to. It's truly true to me.
They weren't mining gold, as McCartney correctly points out that they were later.
During their time in Hamburg, the Beatles started to develop their sound and experiment with different genres. In 1961, the band released their first ever recorded single titled My Bonnie, which featured all 5 of the original members, featuring Tony Sheridan on lead vocals. The sound resembled that of a classic 1950s Elvis Presley rock and roll song. The Beatles may not have made massive waves in Hamburg, but when the band came back to England in 1961, they started gaining more attention performing in their local club, the Cavern Club. Stuart Sutcliffe and Pete Best were dropped from the band temporarily, and Ringo Starr was brought in as their new drummer. As a new 4-piece band, the Beatles went on to make 292 appearances at the Cavern Club over the next 2 years, building up a huge following. It was also here that their first recorded live performance took place, as they performed the Richie Barrett song titled Some Other Guy.
You going to mug me? I'm not going to mug you.
Is that gorgeous or what, eh?
And I believe I can run a decent marathon.
Thank you very much.
Download Veely now.
Some other guy now, taking my love away from me. Oh, now, some other guy now, taking away my sweet desire. Now, some other guy now, I just don't want to hold my hand. Now, I'm a lonely one, if I could feel.
During their performances at the Cavern Club, the Beatles were continually growing their fan base. They also gained the attention from one particular individual, That individual would go on to help sculpt the Beatles into the image that they are known for today. That mastermind was none other than Brian Epstein.
Can you tell us when you first met the Beatles?
Oh, 1961, October, I think.
And whereabouts did you see them?
In the Cavern Club in Liverpool.
And what did you think when you first saw them?
I was sufficiently knocked out.
Lovely rubbish, that's what you're telling me.
And what was the next step from there?
Well, then we got to know each other and eventually worked out a bit of idea of management. See?
I was aware at the time, so I joined later, after Brian.
At any time did you have a feeling that you might reach this dizzy height of success that you're now flying on?
I don't know about the dizzy height, but I always thought they were going to be pretty big, very big.
How did you get associated with Brian Epstein, and how much do you feel you owe him?
Well, we owe him 1 and 6 exactly, but we owe a lot of our success to him, a great deal.
Yeah.
Because I think we might have been able to make hit records because we would have written the songs anyway. This one's run out, and but we wouldn't have. He controlled it, you see.
A lot of people have said that Epstein has emerged as a genius of show business. Do you agree with this?
Well, I'm a bit dodgy, I don't like using the word genius, but there's so many geniuses on LP covers and things like that, that I think he's done more than anybody expected him to do, which entitles people that don't know what's happening to call him a genius. He's very good. I wouldn't say he's a genius.
There never would have been a Beatles, and we wouldn't do this interview now without Epstein. Epstein's genius was getting them to stop eating food on stage at the Cavern, stop telling in-jokes on stage, stop dicking around between songs on stage, get out of those leather jackets and cowboy boots, get some sensible clothes, coats and ties on, something that is palatable and digestible for Middle England, much less the world or Middle America to accept. And when Brian Epstein is criticized for cleaning up the Beatles, I'm saying without his presentational skills that were developed in the record store, the way they had the furniture in the window and all that, without those presentational skills being developed, Epstein would never have known what the public really wanted, and the public would never have accepted the Beatles as they were in Hamburg. Epstein's polishing the Beatles is why we're sitting here talking right now. Had it just relied on the way they were and the roughneck image they had then and the rough sound they produced then, they would have been, maybe they'd have broken nationally, maybe not, but they wouldn't have taken the world on as they did.
With their new image being forged by Brian Epstein, the Beatles were ready to take on the world by storm. In 1962, the band went into the studio to record their first single as a four-piece. Love Me Do was released on the 5th of October 1962 in the UK and went on to show the band's unique sound as they incorporated elements of rock and roll with the blues. In August 1963, the Beatles performed their final show at the Cavern Club and took to the studio once again to record their first self-written album. Please Please Me was the Beatles' first full-length LP and went on to become one of their best-selling albums. The LP contained a variety of fantastic singles, including Love Me Do, but it was the title track that helped the band become the success story that they are known as today.
I think the real breakout moment isn't Love Me Do or From Me to You or any of the first Beatles songs that are known and loved now. I think the really breakout moment is Please Please Me. That song, which started out slowly, has Beatles stamped all over it. It was originally like a Roy Orbison thing, and George Martin heard it. And George Martin said, no, 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 speed it up. And it became the last night I said these words to my girl.
I know you never even try, girl. Come on, come on, come on, come on. Please, 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 oh yeah.
When they finished that particular take, whatever the take was, as we say in the business, George Martin famously on the talkback machine came over and said, fellas, you just recorded your first #1. And I think that is the song, the composition, and the performance And indeed, the studio moment when the Beatles really melded into each other, blended their personalities and their sound to become the four-headed monster, where each individual guy made a great contribution, but 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 didn't equal 4 anymore, it equaled like 27. Please Please Me, I think that's the moment.
Please Please Me was a massive hit in the UK, with its self-titled single reaching #1 on the charts. The album was also ranked 39th on Rolling Stone's list of 500 greatest albums of all time. The Beatles quickly followed up Please Please Me with their second album, With the Beatles, another album that went down extremely well with fans and critics and topped the charts within the UK. By 1963, the Beatles had made it in the UK, selling out shows all over the country. They were the band of the moment. They were so big, in fact, that they were invited to perform at the Royal Variety performance in front of the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret.
Paul, have you thought about your act for the show yet? Any changes in the act, or is it going to be, you know, the usual routine?
No, we'll have to change it, I'm sure. We can't... No, stop it. We'll have to change it, but we can't do the same thing all the time. We haven't thought about what we're going to do yet.
Suits with collars on? Brush parting hair?
Never know.
Something like that?
I may not wear suits. Never know. We've no idea.
But during an interview on the BBC before the show, the Beatles were criticised by Edward Heath, the Lord Privy Seal, as he stated that he had difficulty distinguishing the Beatles' Liverpudlian accents as the Queen's English.
John, in this Royal Variety show, when you're appearing before royalty, your language has got to be pretty good, obviously. This thing about Ted Heath saying that he couldn't distinguish.
I can't understand
the
Ted.
Queen's English.
I can't understand Teddy saying that at all, really. I'm not going to vote for Ted.
But you're not going to change your act just for the Lord Privy Seal?
Oh, no, like, we'll keep, like, the same kind of thing, like, won't we?
Oh, well, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
John Lennon didn't hold back during the performance either, as he made crass comments towards some of the more upper-class guests attending the show.
For our last number, I'd like to ask your help. Would the people in the cheaper seats clap your hands? And the rest of you, if you just rattle your jewellery.
Despite the controversial jokes and comments, the Beatles put on one of the biggest shows they had ever performed, playing some of their biggest singles to a sea of screaming fans. The Royal Variety performance boosted their popularity even more, and by the end of 1963, the Beatles were the biggest band in the UK.
Variety clubs of Britain had little trouble picking this year's showbiz personalities. They needed to look no further than the nearest transistor radios. So at the staid Dorchester Hotel, where crowned heads have often been dined, 4 crown princes receive an accolade from the show world's charitable organization. And we hardly need to mention that they need no charity except from exasperated parents.
But the Beatles hadn't just won over the hearts of their nation. They had also taken over the airways in Europe and Australia, leading to thousands of fans crowding the streets everywhere they went.
When the quartet with hair like unmade beds arrive in the Netherlands, it's the same story as in Britain and the US. People who value their sanity head for cover and let the teenagers take over.
In 1964, the Beatles aimed to win over American audiences, and after a few gigs, despite not being the top billed act, the Beatles were easily regarded as a crowd favourite everywhere they went. As a result, American media were calling it the British Invasion.
New York City cops are hard-pressed protecting the Beatles at their hotel. On every side, there is hero worship that recalls the heydays of Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra. With one Beatle bedded with a sore throat, 3 of the quartet take an airing in Central Park. There was absolutely no truth to the rumor that the zoo's laughing hyena was driven underground.
It wasn't until the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 that the Beatles' popularity reached all new heights. Crowds of fans screamed throughout the whole of their set as the Beatles performed their popular hits.
You let me
It was clear to see that after this performance that America and the world had caught Beatlemania.
Well, it seems to me that after your show, your real problems really begin. What's it like with these fans outside, Paul?
At first, it's murder, because, you know, it looks as though they're going to tear you apart. Once you get the hang of it, you get used to it, and it gets a bit easier.
Do you deliberately try and create these sort of screaming reactions?
No, we just, you know, arrive at the theatre and they're always there waiting. And whenever we're doing a show, the police always come and say, don't look out the window, you know, for the excitement.
I'm dying to look out.
Beatlemania, according to Philip Norman and Hunter Davis and so many great Beatle writers, was somewhat manufactured, but the big bang of it was at the Palladium in '63. The Beatles had played, and the press got a hold of the girls screaming and all that stuff and made it into a scene that dwarfed Sinatra being screamed at by the Bobby Soxers in Manhattan in 1942. There's the wonderful black and white footage of Liverpool playing at Anfield, and the whole cop is singing "She Loves You." And all these guys in the cop are singing "She Loves You." They're deafening, they're so loud. And in '64, when the Beatles broke, after being on Ed Sullivan, I mean, it was then Beatlemania in America. They were in the newspapers all the time, and for some of the dumbest stuff on God's green earth.
And here they are, fresh from their triumphant appearances in the United States. 12,000 young Britons roar a welcome. Their shrieks rise in an awesome wave. Our staff scientist, in an odd moment, calculated that this young mob is generating enough energy to put 3 Atlas missiles in orbit and power 54,000 transistor radios.
I've seen nothing since Beatlemania to be mentioned in the same breath. I include Madonna and Michael Jackson, all these people that I, you know, have the greatest respect for and have bought the recordings of. Nothing was like Beatlemania. The mania part of that is primary. It was nuts.
By 1964, Beatlemania had hit the whole world. Off the back of it, the band teamed up with the film director Richard Lester to capture a day in the life of the Beatles, which also featured the band's 3rd studio album, which was self-titled A Hard Day's Night.
Hard Day's Night is essentially the day in the life of Beatlemania. The movie features the Beatles and their songs, but the movie's about Beatlemania, and it only captures a small slice of it. People see Hard Day's Night, and you see the Beatles, it lets their personalities come out. You see Paul being a very Paul, diplomatic kind of guy, trying to hope things work out. Lennon kind of being a wise guy. Ringo being kind of a cuddly everyman again with a capital E. George Harrison being kind of a quiet guy who says some very quiet, demure, but really funny, dry remarks. Their personalities come to the fold. You see the Beatles playing their tunes. So we've got the Beatles and we've got their music, but again, A Hard Day's Night isn't about the Beatles and it's not about their music. It's about Beatlemania. It is about people going crazy for a band. That is the subject matter of the movie. And in that, even though it's fictionalized, Dick Lester's given us a great documentary.
After the successful release of A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles released their 4th album, Beatles for Sale. This album held the #1 spot for 11 of the 46 weeks that it spent in the top 20. But the Beatles continued to embrace the film world after this album, and in 1964 worked on their next film called Help, a ludicrous comedy that showed all 4 of the band members in ridiculously slapstick situations. The film also featured the band's 5th studio album of the same name. Help was nominated in the category of Album of the Year at the 1966 Grammy Awards, making the Beatles the first rock band that had been recognized in this category. The album also sold 1.3 million copies in just a few months in the US alone. It was another smash hit for the Beatles that produced some outstanding singles, including the title track, which matched the fun, upbeat vibe from the film. In 1965, the Beatles were awarded MBEs by the Queen herself. The ceremony took place in Buckingham Palace, and the grounds were, once again, filled with screaming fans.
Who's been getting in the Ulster's hair the past few years? Why, the boys who invented hair, the Beatles. Fresh from an audience with the Queen, they hold medals, indicating they have been made members of the most excellent order of the British Empire.
The fans and the Beatles themselves were thrilled with the achievement.
Well, gentlemen, first of all, many congratulations on your MBE. The whole country seems very delighted indeed, but how do you feel about it, Paul?
Delighted indeed. You know, I'm glad everyone's delighted. I love it.
But I mean, is it fun for you? Or?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, it'd be fun for you, wouldn't it? You know, if you just woke up one morning and he said, you know, it's great.
Ringo, how did you first hear about it?
Well, we heard about it 6 weeks ago when we got the forms to fill in, and then we knew that we were going to get it 2 days ago, officially.
How did these forms come? What, straight through the post or in the fan mail or what?
I don't, just in brown envelopes. Yeah, they were delivered by somebody, you know, by hand. I think one of Brian's secretaries.
I'll tell you.
All right. Well, how did it happen?
They were sent from the Prime Minister at Downing Street to our manager's office, and they were delivered from there to Twickenham, where we were filming. And then about the day later, we just found them, and we thought we were being called up for the army. And then we opened them, and we found out we weren't. We weren't.
all said that line.
I know, but this is at ITV. That was the other one.
Beatlemania peaked in late 1965 when the Beatles performed their biggest concert to date. Tickets sold out within seconds, as it seemed the whole of America wanted to see the Beatles perform at the Shea Stadium.
After the Shea Stadium, there was nothing else they could ever want to achieve as artists.
We've had offers from people as high as $70 or so for tickets, but of course they're all gone. There aren't any available at any price.
In fact, we've had calls from dignitaries and the British government here in town, from important show business people wanting tickets the last moment, and we can't come up with a ticket anywhere. The kids have the entire house for themselves.
I have a group of girls here from Arroyo High School in El Monte, and we came down here today to see what kind of seats we had to see the Beatles. I bought 10 tickets for $85, and I don't think the girls would be willing to give up their tickets, but I heard that someone had offered $70 for a ticket, and for that I might.
Ladies and gentlemen, they will be here soon. They're ready for you. Are you ready for them?
It was the ultimate rock and roll concert that nobody to this day, even in with the great concerts given by Led Zeppelin, nobody has ever topped that concert. It wasn't a concert of music, it was a concert of the crowd. And it was the top pinnacle of anybody's career that still hasn't been topped today.
The whole concert was filmed as part of a documentary. This film showed off the pure brilliance of the Beatles' performance skills, whilst also showing the grand scale of their concerts. The Beatles had done everything they could. They had broken records, played the biggest stadiums, and dominated the charts all over the world. But behind closed doors, things weren't all glitz and glamour, and the band realized that because of their poor contracts made by Brian Epstein, they weren't making nearly as much money as they deserved. Sales for the single She Loves You, for example, made millions all over the world, but despite that fact, the Beatles only saw £800 from the sales.
Well, on the subject of money, which seems to keep coming into this all the time, how do you go about financing their weekly pocket money? What happens about that? Well, they get, whatever they want from their earnings, and their earnings go into their own company.
Brian Epstein had done a number of bad business deals. I mean, the great one we acknowledge is he gave away 90% of the merchandising rights when they hit America. He could have taken 90% and given the other guys 10%. His publishing deal for Macmillan Music wasn't good. He gave himself part of the record sales. No one knew back in the 60s that maybe it wouldn't be a good idea, now that we're a mega worldwide band, to have our manager be a furniture store guy from Liverpool. The Stones had a 19-year-old guy managing them when they started, Andrew Lou Oldham. But all of these British bands in particular were managed by well-meaning amateurs in the field they were in. It's a shame, because I think Brian Epstein is a key player and responsible for making them palatable to the public. But at the same time, his bad business deals set the seeds for the Beatles going against each other. The Beatles sound of their mop-top era, shall we say, peaks and sort of ends on Help. It's the last album where they're audibly and lovably these cheeky little Liverpudlians. The next album is, of course, Rubber Soul, and that's the album that just made the west coast of California, the Future Birds, Buffalo Springfields, and the Jefferson Airplane. Rubber Soul is the one that's like, everyone's set up. This isn't just a showbiz boy band act of the era. All those prototype hippies set up.
And what's really happening is you're seeing a lot more experimentation with sound, different kinds of rhythm, with different kinds of song structure, psychedelia, those kind of things.
And by the time you get to Revolver, the door is open. It's the first Beatle album. Even Rubber Soul, while not mop-top stuff, very adult, mature music on Rubber Soul. But even Rubber Soul was of a uniform. The songs all sounded like the same guys recorded them. Revolver was their first kind of album like the White Album, that the songs didn't sound, it was almost the same band. For instance, Harrison turns in these Indian songs like Love to You, Ringo sings a sort of music hall-y Yellow Submarine, McCartney sings these wonderful ballads like For No One, and Lennon's doing that crazy psychedelia of She Said, and I'm Only Sleeping. It doesn't even sound like the same record. By the time you get to Revolver, that's the first album where the Beatles have, mop-top's gone, doesn't exist anymore. And the Beatles are open for all offers. That is the first album where all bets are off and every door and every window in the building is open.
Despite their new sound, the Beatles continued to book tours around the world. However, in March 1966, John Lennon got himself and the Beatles into a massive controversy with the American press, as he was quoted as saying the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, causing one of the biggest band boycotts the world had ever seen.
Maureen Cleave had interviewed John Lennon, and she was interviewing each Beatle for the Evening Standard, as I recall. In the Lennon one, he said, we're more popular than Jesus. Christianity will vanish and grow. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Danny Fields, who later managed the Ramones, was working at a superficial teenage pulp magazine called Datebook. And he got this interview because they would compete, these superficial teen magazines in America would compete to get license to be the first American company to print. And he saw this Lennon interview and his eyes bugged out with the quotes about Christianity will vanish and shrink. And he took those quotes and put them in Datebook in big bold-faced type. And boom, somebody saw it down south and it was just match into a tin can full of kerosene. Boom. I remember the Beatle banning and the book burn and the Beatle record burning and the kerfuffle over Lennon saying they were more popular than Jesus. It was really something, really ugly. It put a serious dent into their popularity in the United States.
The American public started burning Beatles records in response to the comments, and in South Africa, all Beatles records were banned from retail stores. In response to Lennon's comments, the KKK publicly threatened to infiltrate the Beatles' next show and stop it completely because of their so-called blasphemous comments. Despite the hostile environment in the US and other parts of the world, the Beatles continued to branch out to other countries. In late 1966, the Beatles travelled to Asia, performing at venues in Japan and the Philippines. Some right-wing politicians didn't take too kindly to the Beatles' performances, as they played shows in what was seen as sacred temples. Activists lined the streets with banners saying, "Damn Beatles, go home." But despite the hostility, the band managed to play to over 200,000 fans. By 1967, it was clear that the Beatles had had enough of touring and wanted to just focus strictly on their music and their evolving sound.
So the Beatles stopped performing live in 1967. That's the last time that they do a really professional, formal gig.
The Beatles were already tired of touring before '66, but by '66, they're still doing Long Tall Sally on stage. And their stage sound no more reflected what they were doing in the studio than The Man in the Moon. So they had to make a decision. Do we continue to have this dichotomy of the studio moving forward and doing Long Tall Sally, etc., Babies in Black, live? So they wanted to move forward, and the technology was not there for the Beatles to reproduce their studio records on stage then. So they made the, let's just stop touring. We're not happy with the travel. Our records are selling anyway, and you really toured to promote the records. So let's stop touring and let's start to promote our own music as best we possibly can. So what do? So we go from Revolver, where all bets are off and we'll take any influence you've got out there, and they go to the very Baroque, the very Rococo Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Sgt. Pepper is really seen to be the first concept album, and what I mean by that is there's a beginning, a middle, and end. There's a story that's told throughout the whole record, the way that there's different kind of mysticisms running through it. Even the very front cover itself, the Beatles are creating characters, them in almost like military outfits, but them also positioned in this mural with other popular culture figures through time. It's like an alternative Beatles reality, if you would.
I mean, there was no music like it before. The cover, everything. It put what was probably something not everyone was maybe aware of on the map. The whole it was like the end of the sweet pop song era and the start of people making real albums, as opposed to a collection of songs.
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band really was a turning point for the Beatles. It captured their newfound creativity and revitalized their sound. But these recent albums also displayed George Harrison coming out of his shell and helped show off his songwriting abilities.
Well, I think George realised what he was up against with both John and Paul, and also me to a certain extent, because I must confess that I would obviously concentrate on the guys who were giving me the hits. And in the beginning, George's work was kind of tolerated. Oh yes, we must have a George song in this thing. It's kind of saying, well, it's not going to be as good as the others, but we'll let him have it on, which was terribly unfair. I know that, and I do regret that. But you can't blame me, because I had to deal with two marvellous people as well as him.
Initially, he was really the third member of the band. Once they hit that roller coaster ride of success and he started to play some of those great solos, he was then accepted, I think, musically by Paul and by John as being a very, very integral part of the group.
With talents like John and Paul, who are probably the greatest songwriters of the 20th century as far as we're concerned, it's tough opposition, and they collaborated and kind of also rivaled each other in their writing. George didn't have anybody. George had to do it by himself.
It was both hard for George Harrison and beneficial to be in the flight path of Lennon and McCartney. I say this because he wasn't a songwriter early on, so he's the fly on the wall.
He worked away at it, and he had tremendous determination and application. He would craft his music meticulously with every little stitch in the canvas, and gradually built up his songwriting technique to a point where he became a great writer. He wasn't to begin with, but then he started writing great songs.
With our love, we could save
Not only was George Harrison emerging as more of a frontman figure, there was another member of the band that was catching the eyes of fans everywhere, displaying his true creativity and his skills within the studio. Some called him the fifth member of the Beatles, but to everyone, he's known as Sir George Martin.
In America, we always talk about you can reinvent yourself in America and you can be anything you want to be. Well, George Martin grew up impoverished in North London and very poor. Yet when he became an officer in the Second World War, he had to immediately learn to talk posh because the other officers wouldn't accept him. Martin's deep development and techniques with these comedy records and light drama recordings made him perfect for the Beatles, who wanted more and more and more. How do you get that sound? How do you get this sound? He was the perfect guy. Had they just had a regular producer, like a standard EMI staff producer who did pop records, it would have been a very different, more closely defined Beatle world. With George Martin on board, you can have the sound effects of Yellow Submarine, you can have the craziness that's going on in those Magical Mystery Tour tracks. You can have the expansion that we've heard in the reissue of Sgt. Pepper by his son, Giles Martin.
They'd seen his face before. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Law.
You could never have had that with just a regular coat and tie EMI staff producer. You needed a guy who'd done things besides pop music records. And that was ex-officer Sir George Martin, who knew it. You know, he's made records with Peter Sellers. I mean, what needs to be said?
Tragically, in August 1967, the Beatles had been told the news that their faithful manager and loving friend, Brian Epstein, had died of a drugs overdose. The band were absolutely devastated.
I spoke to him Wednesday evening, the evening before we first saw Maharishi's lecture, and he was in great spirits.
Did the Maharishi give you any words of comfort?
Yes, well,
his meditation gives you confidence enough to withstand something like this, even the short amount we've had.
The Beatles sought solace during the start of 1968 to get away from being in the public eye 24/7. They went to India to focus on mindfulness and engaged in meditation activities with their teacher Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. This experience allowed the band to take a step back and reflect on their success, whilst also to recover from the loss of their friend Brian Epstein.
Far from the noise and pace of city life, in the cool, clear air of Rishikesh, North India, Pathé News reports from the meditation retreat of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the man who, through transcendental meditation, is currently bringing peace of mind to the Beatles. Flower-loving Yogi told reporters that his brand of peace of mind could only be truly appreciated by intelligent men of the world with rewarding activities and high incomes. Among his most valued disciples were the Beatles, top of the pop pupils. He did his best to keep them away from outsiders, but George had a way for us. Keeping company with himself, it could be part of the treatment, John stalked along the shady paths. Ringo enjoyed the peace of togetherness with Mrs. Ringo. It was a very peaceful scene. So different from those not-so-far-off times when just a glimpse of the Beatles was enough to ruin the meditation chances of anyone within earshot. Now, 2 by 2, the world-famous quartet strolled quietly in the lovely meditation preserve. Paul and Ringo shed the cares of their successful world. Close behind, George and John, complete with blanket for even more peace. That great screen star Greta Garbo used to crave solitude. In these days, it's even harder to come by. But the Beatles have found it.
Despite the peaceful retreat, When the band got back into the studio in mid-1968, the band's relationship wasn't the same as it was. John Lennon looked and acted like he didn't want to be within the band anymore and wanted to focus on his new relationship with local artist Yoko Ono.
John seemed to be turning away from the efforts of the Beatles in 67, 68, 69 and spending more time and energy on the art he was creating with Yoko Ono and also the art that Yoko Ono had created that he wanted to promote to the public sphere. I think they were hurt that their fearless leader was turning away from them a bit and was getting such succor and inspiration from someone else other than the Beatles, and they didn't like it. Beatles sessions had been pretty much closed. A lot of Beatles sessions, someone would come in from next door that was recording, like Sounds Incorporated or Pink Floyd, but they'd say hi and then they'd split. And he was inviting Yoko to just the session, period. I know that didn't sit well with the members of the Fab Four. They've been fair about that. And if you look, by the time they're doing the picture sleeve, i.e. the photo shoot for the picture sleeve of Ballad of John and Yoko and Old Brown Shoe, she's in the photograph. Well, the song is called The Ballad of John and Yoko, but on the flip side, you know, she's in the Beatle photograph for Old Brown Shoe. Just so there's 5 people on the single sleeve. And I think there is an argument that you can see why someone would draw a line at having a cot or a sofa brought in for an extraneous person, family member, no matter how much you loved them and were devoted to them at your recording sessions. I think there was a point.
Tension seemed high with all the members, but by the end of 1968, the Beatles came back and released their next studio album titled The Beatles, also known as The White Album.
You keep going on, and Dylan's basement tapes are leaking out. The Beatles would have heard the acetates, I'm sure, so that's where you get your White Album. Part of the White Album is very developed, but not like Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. About a third of the White Album is the band, all 4 of them, playing in the studio, as they did in the old days. Stuff like Birthday, Helter Skelter, and Your Blues. Those 3 songs of them in the studio looking at each other, 1, 2, 3, all in. So you see, the White Album is both a slight back to basics, very successful back to basics, and you also see it as the beginning of their the solo careers, or at least I do.
The White Album was the first Beatles album released on their own record label, Apple Records. It also featured one of the Beatles' most popular songs to date, Hey Jude, a soft melodic song that Paul McCartney dedicated to John Lennon's son after Lennon's divorce to Cynthia in 1968. It was also performed on David Frost's Sunday Show, which was the Beatles' first live performance on TV since they stopped touring the world in 1967.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better. Remember.
After the White Album, tension was rising again within the studio. Band members were leaving left, right and centre for short breaks to get away from the hostile working environments, including George Martin. Alan Klein joined the band as the new manager, but unfortunately Paul McCartney objected to his involvement, stating he wanted the management to go to his father-in-law, Lee Eastman. Projects they were working on were being pushed aside, and it felt as though each member was wanting to focus on their solo careers. But little did they know that their most successful creation was right around the corner.
But then they came back with Abbey Road, the last album they recorded in order. It wasn't the last album released, but it was the last album they recorded as an ensemble, and it's just a cracking record. There are those that say Lennon was losing interest by now, and he's not on a fair bit of Abbey Road, but certainly the other 3 are, and certainly Lennon was there for his songs. He's there for Come Together, Polyethylene Pam, Golden Slumber, Sun King. He's there for his songs. He's there at the ending melody when he, McCartney, and Harrison take those solos on the song The End. And it's a great record. It's Sir George Martin's favorite Beatle album, and it might be mine. And it's the way I'd like to remember him, not Let It Be. It's the way I'd like to remember it, the peak of their powers.
Abbey Road wasn't the final release for the Beatles. Since 1968, Paul McCartney had been arranging a film session to document life within the studio and the recording of their, what would be, final album, Let It Be. But unfortunately, this album took over 3 years to finalize due to hostility within the band, and the documentary that went alongside that, which was meant to display the making of the album, actually displayed the breakup of the Beatles.
The Let It Be film is a very quixotic, bittersweet chapter in the Beatles' career. I believe the Let It Be album is the only bad album in the Beatles' catalog. I think it never should have come out. Let It Be just doesn't have a ton of good songs on it. And listening to the outtakes and the bootlegs which are out there, they're frequently sort of out of tune and just jamming. They're not seriously working. So Let It Be is a very disappointing chapter in the Beatles' history, and I keep hearing that there's other film canisters shot, you know, the unreleased footage, and that there's more to come out, but I don't see how it's going to be anything you really want to hear, because the outtakes of Let It Be that I've heard, where they're doing like House of the Rising Sun or a Whole Lot of Shakin' Going On or Bebop Alua or one of their own early songs, none of it's very good.
But I love you. Seems that I'm always love you. Oh, you do me bad.
During the recording process of this album, the Beatles performed a concert on top of the band's label's rooftop that was captured for the documentary. It was the first time they had performed live in front of an audience for over 2 years. It would also go on to be their last ever live performance. Let It Be finally released in May 1970 and was criticised as being one of the Beatles' worst albums by some critics. The title track, however, written by McCartney, became an instant hit. The song, according to McCartney, was said to be based on a phrase he'd heard from his mother in a dream, a sign for him not to worry about the dangers of life and to live it to its fullest.
When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. And in my hour of darkness, she is standing right in front of me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Let it be.
Shortly after Let It Be was released, the Beatles were no more. It was the end of an era and the last we'd see of the Fab Four. The breakup of the Beatles shocked the world and left fans wondering what was next for the four members. Paul McCartney and George Harrison went on to focus on their solo careers, releasing some monumental albums like Tug of War and All Things Must Pass. John Lennon focused on his efforts on Yoko Ono's art and peace activism within the US, and Ringo Starr focused his efforts within the film industry. All four members looked like they were doing things that they loved, and fans were always hoping that maybe there was a chance that the Fab Four could come back together again and play once again as the Beatles. But on the 8th of December 1980, all hopes of a reunion were gone as the world felt the shockwaves of some truly devastating news.
The murder of John Lennon in New York last night is full of ironies. He just started a successful musical comeback after years of withdrawal. In his last recorded interview, he said what he liked about New York was the security, even the autograph hunters who only wanted a signature and then left him alone. And the man charged with Lennon's murder was an autograph hunter.
John Lennon was a New Yorker by adoption, and as soon as the word of the shooting was out, carried by radio stations across the city, his admirers started to gather. Their reaction was one of disbelief.
The body has been taken over town across to East 30th Street to the medical examiner's office. And the medical examiner's office told the BBC this morning that 4 bullets were in fact shot into John Lennon, one of which went through the body, one of which remained. It's thought that he died almost instantly.
George Harrison was tonight said to be stunned. He said that after all we went through together, I had and still have great respect for him.
He was seeking peace. I mean, he loved his fellow human beings, but he just wanted to have a respite from the hurly-burly of the showbiz world. And he actually said to me, he said, look, for the first time in my life, I don't have to do anything. I can now spend some time with my new son, my wife, and not have to be answered to anybody. And I think that was really what he wanted.
Paul McCartney was asked to comment on the loss of his best friend, but his words and appearance shocked journalists.
Have you discussed the death with any of the other Beatles?
No.
Do you plan to?
Probably, yeah.
What were you recording today?
I was just listening to some stuff, I just didn't want to sit at home.
Why?
Well, I didn't feel like it.
What time did you hear the news?
This morning sometime.
Very early?
Yeah. Go on now, yeah? Drag, isn't it? Okay, cheers. Bye-bye.
Let's go. Well, guys.
Thank you.
Go. Goodbye.
Despite Paul McCartney's cold demeanour, he went on to say that he was devastated by the news and just didn't know how to handle it at the time. The world was stunned by the death of John Lennon.
I'm using my money and my time to promote peace. And when the money runs out and the time runs out, we should have peace by then.
The three Beatles continued to focus on their music and side projects through the 80s and 90s, whilst always remembering the loss of their dear friends who had left them. But once again in 2002, the world was to fall witness to more tragic news that another member had lost his life due to cancer.
I'm very sad, devastated. We've known he's been ill for a long time, and just very sad to hear that he's passed on. He's a lovely man. I love him dearly. I grew up with him, and I like to remember all the great times we had together in Liverpool and with the Beatles, and ever since, really.
It's been an awful shock today because, I mean, we've known it's been coming for a long while, but it still doesn't prepare you for the day when it actually happens. George is a wonderful man and a fine musician, but most importantly, I think he was a very loving person, full of humour, and I don't think he really wanted to be a famous person. I think he wanted to do his own stuff by himself. And fortunately, he had, in Olivia and Danny, he had a wonderful family, and my heart goes out to them.
I was lucky enough to see him a couple of weeks ago, and he was still laughing and joking. Very brave man, And I'm just privileged to have known him. And I love him like he's my brother. It was a very sad day for me and for a lot of other people. But I think he would have wanted us, you know, to get on and be loving and remember him as the great man he was.
It is a spiritual experience, but it's all down to the individual, you know, what you can manifest within yourself as to the value of anything. Really, the whole of life should be a spiritual experience because we are spirits who are just encased in bodies. People forget that and think they're just this body, but we're actually spirits in bodies.
Despite the loss of Brian Epstein, John Lennon and George Harrison, the Beatles' legacy will forever live on. Their music still sells around the world, and their mop-top image is still recognizable everywhere. In 2016, the remaining Beatles teamed up with the award-winning film director Ron Howard to make a documentary that showed off some of the unseen footage from some of the Beatles' biggest shows and historic moments.
Well, for me, it's been a great experience. It first began as just a fun, cool, creative adventure. Then I became very intimidated by it when I realized how important it was to fans. And now it's just proved to be a very gratifying experience, and I'm already nostalgic for it. I'm kind of, after 2 years of working with it, I'm a little sad to let it go.
8 Days a Week was praised by fans and critics for its cinematic style of storytelling and the way it showed audiences a brand new insight into the world of the Beatles. The Beatles have made their mark on history. They are the Fab Four, the sound of a generation, and the brilliant minds behind some of the most revolutionary music the industry has ever seen.
They really will go down as a milestone, as a cultural importance, as Shakespeare or the Royals or whomever, you know. They will. It is not schoolboy fantasy. They will go down as one of the great things this country has produced. The Fab Four, they will.
They are a cultural phenomenon. They have inspired so many people all over the world, and it's safe to say that the Beatles will keep inspiring generations for years to come.
Thank God I and other baby boomers invested our emotional time and space with folks that gave back and of themselves to society. And for that, 2 thumbs up for the Fab Four. Right on, boys.
I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves. I hope we pass the audition.